Cuando digo que me duele mi alma, se lo juro, no había conocido lo que era un dolor del alma.
On March 15th, Mirelys Casique got one last call from her son before his deportation.
Me dijo, mami, ya vamos saliendo, eso, vamos para Venezuela. Y yo le dije que yo lo iba a esperar.
But Francisco García Casique never arrived. Instead, he was sent to El Salvador's CECOT prison, where Mirelys recognized him by his tattoos and government photos.
Yo me di cuenta que era mi hijo. Yo conozco a mi hijo.
The Department of Homeland Security released a statement to KLTV saying in part that Francisco was detained as a, quote, confirmed member of the Tren de Aragua gang.
The issue here is that those individuals that were sent and accused of being part of Tren de Aragua and placed in CECOT as a result did not themselves get the opportunity to respond to that allegation.
Executive Director of Together and Free, Michelle Bernay, has been in contact with over 100 Venezuelan families like Mirelys. Documents shared by Mirelys show Francisco had no criminal history in Venezuela. KLTV was unable to independently verify those documents.
No. Mi hijo jamás, aquí en Venezuela, mi hijo ni siquiera en una estación policial ha estado.
Our check for a criminal record in East Texas returned no results. Francisco entered the U.S. unlawfully in 2023. After missing an immigration court hearing, a judge signed his deportation in April 2024. He was later released by ICE under supervision. Bernay suspects the fact that he was released under supervision indicates ICE believed he was no threat to anyone.
Many of these individuals had already gone through some sort of a process of clearance or of screening. And were released into the community because they had not been found to be a public safety risk.
Francisco worked in Longview as a barber until his arrest this February, which led to his deportation to CECOT. Bernay says confusion and fear now surround the families of the deported men.
There's been no official contact with any of these men. Their family members have no idea if they're even alive.
As Mirelys walks the streets of Maracay, Venezuela, she holds onto the only thing left, hope. Naomi Sanchez, KLTV 7 News.